Hey guys, tonight we begin with what might be the most delusional fantasy in modern romance culture, the Victorian wedding. You know, those Pinterest-perfect images of elaborate gowns, candlelit ceremonies, and genteel celebrations that make you think, now that's how people used to get married properly. Well, forget the Hollywood version, because the truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single day at an actual Victorian wedding. Between the crushing corsets, the literal crushing social expectations, and the very real possibility of dying from your wedding cake, these celebrations were less romantic fairy tale and more survival endurance test with fancy clothes. So before you get comfortable dreaming about vintage romance, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more reality checks about the past. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, where we'll discover why saying I do in the 1800s meant saying I do to a world of suffering you can barely imagine. Picture this. You're getting ready for your dream Victorian wedding, and you slip into that gorgeous white gown you've been fantasizing about. Except here's the thing, that dress weighs about as much as a small refrigerator, and the corset underneath is literally trying to murder you. Victorian wedding dresses weren't just clothing. They were architectural marvels designed by people who apparently thought women didn't need to breathe. We're talking about 15 to 20 pounds of fabric, beading, and trim that turned every bride into a walking tent. The skirts were so wide that doorways became your natural enemy, and sitting down required the same level of engineering expertise as launching a rocket. But the real villain here was the corset. Imagine someone wrapping a vise around your rib cage and then tightening it until your organs rearrange themselves like Tetris pieces. Victorian women regularly had their waists cinched down to 16 to 18 inches. And yes, that sound you just heard was your modern spine crying in solidarity. Fainting wasn't a delicate feminine swoon. It was your body literally shutting down from oxygen deprivation. And the best part? You had to wear this torture device for 12 to 16 hours straight, while dancing, while eating a 7-course meal, while pretending to be the picture of graceful femininity. Meanwhile, your husband-to-be got to wear pants and a jacket. Revolutionary stuff, really. The wedding photos you see from this era, those aren't smiles, those are grimaces of people trying not to pass out while standing perfectly still for 30-second exposure times. Because yes, even the photography was an endurance test. Now let's talk about the actual wedding ceremony, which was less joining two hearts in love and more public performance of your family's social, standing with the very real threat of lifelong shame if you mess up. First off, forget everything you know about wedding guest lists. Victorian weddings weren't intimate gatherings of close friends and family. They were strategic social operations where every invitation was calculated. Every seating arrangement was a political statement, and every slight was remembered for generations. Showing up underdressed was essentially declaring war on the host family. The ceremony itself was a masterclass in standing still while suffering. Churches in the 1800s were basically refrigerators with stained glass windows. We're talking about buildings with no heating, where your breath formed clouds and the stone floors conducted cold, like they were trying to freeze your feet to the ground. Everyone stood for the entire service, sometimes up to 2 hours, in those crushing outfits we just discussed, while the minister delivered sermons that would make modern TED Talks look like haikus. And speaking of the minister, these weren't the friendly, personable officiants you might know today. Victorian clergy took their role as moral guardians seriously, which meant wedding sermons were often fire and brimstone affairs about the heavy burden of marriage, the woman's duty to submit, and the general sinfulness of human nature. Nothing says romantic celebration like a 45-minute lecture about how you're probably going to hell. But here's where it gets really fun. If you were a woman, this ceremony was basically your funeral for your legal existence. The moment you said "I do," you ceased to exist as a legal person. Your property, his now, your money, also his, your children, legally his, your right to vote, what rights? You were essentially signing up to become a very expensive pet with fancier clothing. Survive the ceremony? Congratulations, now you get to navigate the reception, which was basically a minefield of social etiquette, wrapped in enough toxic substances to kill a small village. Victorian wedding receptions were elaborate affairs that lasted anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. Yes, you read that right. Half a day of forced socializing while wearing that torture device we call a wedding dress. The food looked impressive, but here's the thing. Victorian food safety standards were basically, if it doesn't walk away, it's probably fine. The wedding cake alone was a death trap disguised as dessert. Victorian bakers used lead-based white icing to achieve that perfect alabaster finish that looked so elegant in photographs. Every slice was literally poisoning your guests, but hey, at least it photographed well. And the decorations? Often made with toxic dyes and non-food items that would make modern health inspectors weep. The drinking situation was equally hazardous. Wine was often fortified with lead to improve the color and taste. Punch was made with questionable water sources, and the popular wedding drink of the era, champagne, was frequently adulterated with everything from chalk to strychnine. Your reception was basically a chemistry experiment where everyone was a test subject. And let's talk about the dancing. In those massive gowns and crushing corsets, dancing was less artistic expression and more like performance art titled, "How Long Before I Collapse?" The popular dances of the era required precise, energetic movements while maintaining perfect posture and never, ever showing that you were struggling to breathe. Fainting on the dance floor wasn't romantic. It was Tuesday. But perhaps the most brutal part of the reception was the gift-giving ceremony. Imagine standing in those clothes in that heat for hours while every single guest presented their gift and expected a personal, gracious response. This wasn't a quick thank you. This was a full performance of gratitude for every single present, many of which were deeply personal judgment calls on your domestic abilities. Think the wedding day was rough? The honeymoon was where Victorian newlyweds discovered that romance and reality were about as compatible as oil and water. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Victorian sexual education was essentially figure it out yourself, and whatever you do, don't enjoy it. Most brides went into their wedding night with less knowledge about sex than a modern middle schooler. The prevailing wisdom was that good women didn't desire physical intimacy. They endured it for the sake of reproduction. Wedding nights were often traumatic experiences that set the tone for marriages built on ignorance and shame. But even if you somehow navigated that minefield, the practical realities of Victorian honeymoons were their own special kind of nightmare. Travel meant stagecoaches or early trains, basically being trapped in a wooden box that was enthusiastically trying to rattle your bones apart. A journey that takes 2 hours today took 2 days then, and you'd arrive at your destination looking like you'd been through a paint mixer. The accommodations weren't much better. Victorian hotels were notorious for their creative approaches to hygiene, which is to say they didn't have any. Bed bugs weren't a possibility. They were a guarantee. The beds themselves were often shared with strangers because privacy was a luxury most establishments couldn't afford to offer. Nothing says romantic getaway like sleeping next to complete strangers who may or may not be carrying communicable diseases. And the food on these romantic trips? Victorian travelers subsisted on whatever they could find that hadn't obviously started decomposing. Roadside inns served meals that would make prison food look gourmet. Fresh vegetables were a fantasy, meat was often questionable, and the water was frequently more dangerous than the alcohol. But here's the real kicker. The entire honeymoon was a performance. These weren't private romantic escapes. They were public demonstrations of your new married status. Every stop was an opportunity for judgment. Every interaction was scrutinized, and every misstep was gossip material that would follow you for years. Let's talk about what these Victorian weddings actually cost, because if you think modern weddings are expensive, Victorian celebrations would make your credit card spontaneously combust. A proper Victorian wedding for the middle class could easily cost the equivalent of $50,000 to $100,000 in today's money. And this wasn't optional. Failing to meet social expectations meant social exile, which in Victorian society was basically a death sentence for your family's reputation. The dress alone was often worth more than most people's annual salary. We're talking about garments that required months of hand-sewing imported fabrics and enough beating to sink a small boat. Families regularly went into debt for a single dress that would be worn once and then preserved like a religious relic. The flowers were another budget killer. Victorian weddings required elaborate floral arrangements that looked like they were designed by someone who thought subtlety was a foreign concept. Orange blossoms were mandatory for bridal bouquets, and if you were getting married outside of orange growing season, you were basically buying small fortunes in imported flowers that would wilt before the ceremony ended. And then there was the food. Victorian wedding feasts were elaborate affairs with multiple courses, exotic ingredients, and presentation standards that would challenge modern catering companies. We're talking about meals that required teams of servants working for days to prepare, all for a single afternoon of eating that most guests were too corseted to properly enjoy. But perhaps the most expensive part was the social obligation. Victorian weddings weren't just about the couple. They were about demonstrating your family's worth to society. Every detail was scrutinized. Every expense was compared to other families' weddings. And falling short wasn't just embarrassing. It was devastating to your social standing for generations. Here's something they don't tell you about Victorian weddings. They were basically medical emergency waiting rooms disguised as celebrations. Those corsets we discussed earlier, they didn't just make breathing difficult, they actively damaged internal organs. Victorian women regularly suffered from displaced ribs, compressed livers, and what doctors euphemistically called tight lacing syndrome, which was basically your body trying to survive being slowly crushed to death. Wedding days, with their extended wear time and physical demands, often triggered serious medical episodes. The fainting wasn't just from excitement or emotion, it was from legitimate oxygen deprivation. Victorian wedding parties often included designated fainting stations with smelling salts and places for unconscious guests to recover. This wasn't seen as a medical emergency. It was just part of the day's entertainment. And let's talk about those wedding gifts, because Victorian present giving was apparently designed by people who thought subtle poisoning was hilarious. Popular wedding gifts included items made with lead crystal, mercury-treated mirrors, and arsenic-based green paints that were absolutely gorgeous and absolutely lethal. Your wedding registry was basically a catalog of beautiful ways to accidentally kill yourself. The makeup and cosmetics were equally dangerous. Victorian brides achieved that perfect pale complexion using lead-based face powders and mercury, treatments that literally ate away at their skin. The rouge was made with vermilion that contained mercury, and the eye makeup often included lead and antimony. Looking beautiful for your wedding meant slowly poisoning yourself with heavy metals. Even the wedding venues were health hazards. Victorian buildings were notorious for their poor ventilation, lead paint, and asbestos insulation. Gas lighting meant constant low-level carbon monoxide exposure, and the popular wallpapers were often made with arsenic-based dyes that literally made people sick just by being in the room. So, how's your day been? Because after diving into the reality of Victorian weddings, your worst modern wedding experience probably looks like a luxury spa day in comparison. These weren't the romantic fairy tales we've been sold by period dramas and Pinterest boards. They were elaborate endurance tests wrapped in beautiful fabrics and tied together with enough social pressure to crush a small building. Every aspect, from the clothes that couldn't be properly cleaned to the food that was actively trying to poison you, was designed to test the limits of human survival. The truth is, Victorian brides weren't just saying, "I do" to their husbands. They were saying, "I do" to a lifetime of physical discomfort, social performance, and medical dangers that would make modern extreme sports look like gentle yoga. They survived wedding days that combined the physical demands of a marathon, the social pressure of a job interview, and the medical risks of a chemistry experiment. And yet they did it. They laced up those killer corsets, smiled through the poisoning, and danced in those impossible dresses. They turned potential death traps into celebrations, and somehow managed to find joy in experiences that would send modern people straight to therapy. So the next time you complain about your wedding planning stress, or grumble about spending too much on flowers, or worry about whether your dress looks perfect, remember the Victorian brides who risked their lives just to walk down the aisle. They lasted through centuries of this elaborate torture, and maybe, just maybe, that's why we still talk about them today. Because if surviving a Victorian wedding doesn't prove human resilience, nothing does.